Greetings, one and all. I recently went to an exhibition at the Tate Britain by Edward Burrough, which ends very soon, so you haven't got many days left to go and look at it. But I found his artwork at first very disturbing, and it took me a while to comprehend what he was trying to say. Though I'm going to show this picture, which I do find very interesting, of people, or ladies, with motor engines as their heads, as if they're all being driven by their brains, maybe, driven by machines. Is he depicting that? He was around when Gurdjieff was alive. I wonder if he heard of Gurdjieff's teachings or got wind of what Gurdjieff had been saying about us all being automatons. And I find it interesting that this painting that he's done depicts, like I say, these engines in people's heads. One of them looks like she's wearing an old-style camera on her head, as if she's filming everything that she's seeing. Another's got the contraptions of the wheels and the spools going round and round. And it's like they're watching life, but not partaking in life, though there is life going on all around them. There's even a little dude on the left that's got a pair of horns on him, and it looks like he might be doing a bit of a demonic kind of style. Is that what he's trying to depict here, that the devil leads everyone astray as the people in the background are dancing or are half dressed? And Edward Burrough travelled a lot of the world, seeing all different kinds of cultures and civilizations, and becoming aware of how people parted to excess was how his painting started, and towards the end of the exhibition it turned into how he ended up being a war artist. And the very last room, which was one of I spent a lot of time in actually, was depicting how materialism is trying to destroy the countryside, something I'm very anti myself. You know, the world is being concreted over, and we should be working with the countryside, not taking it over. So he's a man that follows my own heart in how we should be looking after the world. And I can see how he probably fell into some kind of depression about all this, and then depicted it in his paintings, which are quite stark, yet at the same time have a lot of meaning to them. And in the war paintings, which I'm going to show as well, I'm not showing all of them, but just some of them, and in the nature paintings, he shows other beings, mystical beings, like gods and goddesses, or the horned gods and the various goddesses of nature and such like, obviously looking quite distraught at the sight of their countryside being ripped up by humanity and their horrible diggers, and the petroleum being sapped out of the earth so that we can drive our awful cars. And in his war paintings, he talks about how all the soldiers are driven by demonics, and he's painting this, and it's something that I find quite interesting. Of we have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, and I feel that's what he's trying to get across here, and that soldiers are driven by demons. And even Gurdjieff talks about how, you know, soldiers take themselves off to war and seem to think it's okay to take the orders and kill somebody, where is their conscience in this? And of course this is the problem with the world at the moment. I've done various shows on conscience, and it's something we need to help wake people up to, is their conscience, and then they'll wake up and hopefully start changing the way they think, feel and speak about other cultures, people, and start looking after this planet. You know, I feel things are changing anyway. I'm sure you're seeing things are changing in the world news, hopefully for the better. We must always pray for peace for one and all. In fact, at the same Tate, actually it was Tate Modern, they had the Picasso paintings there, where they had the Dove of Peace that he painted. Though I don't think he called it the Dove of Peace, but I took it as it's the Dove of Peace. But it's a beautiful painting of a dove. I might slip that one in this show if I remember as well. Gurdjieff writes about soldiers in the chapter Art, but there are many other quotes elsewhere about his ideas on war and what soldiers are being led to do. Obviously, they're just following orders. They're automatons for the army, the navy, or whatever military force they follow. But he's talking about how he was in Beelzebub's Tales in the chapter of Art. They were looking at a soldier and a cobbler fighting in the street and disturbing the public peace, and here you are leisurely strolling about, imagining yourself God knows who, and leering at the passing wives of honest and respectable citizens. Just wait, you scamp. Through my chief, the city's chief physician, I shall report to your chief your negligence and breach of duty. And obviously soldiers and anybody that picks up arms to fight and kill another person are not using their conscience. I myself think they're being driven by some kind of demonic being. And he later goes on to say, well then, these free learned beings, well, this should be these free learned brain beings, who were thus cast impromptu by the fourth learned being for fulfilling every kind of perception and manifestation, which had to flow by law of types foreign to them, or as your favourites say, of strange roles, namely of the roles of cobbler, soldier, and policeman, further produced their experiences, and from them their reflexive manifestations, thanks to the being property in them called Ikrilatskakra, a property also well known to the learned beings of the planet Earth of that being, who are already able to perfect their presences up to the ableness of actualizing this property. So the beings that aren't developing themselves are not developing this property inside them, and instead are just being driven by mechanical life as they go about their ways. But on another chapter, in the chapter of hypnotism, which is a very good chapter to discuss, because as we know, most people are hypnotized, he does hint at how people are receiving the suggestions from other beings. And this is in, like I say, the chapter Hypnotism. Right then, let me see where I was going to start. So he was talking about automatic impelling causes. As the automatic impelling causes, which have become their usual for contemporary beings, for the revival also of such a branch of their contemporary science, were exceedingly peculiar, and even, as they themselves would say, piquant facts. It will, in my opinion, be very interesting to tell you a little more in detail also about this said revival. I'm just going to add here, I'm thinking he's talking about all the spiritism and the hypnotism that became a revival in the early 1900s. Although contemporary learned beings there affirm that the beginning of this branch of their science was made by a certain English professor named Braid, and that it was developed by the French professor Charcot, yet in reality this was not so at all. From my detailed investigations of this said question, by the way, it became also clear that the former Braid had unmistakable signs of the properties of a Hasnas moss, and the latter, Charcot, had the typical properties of a mama's darling. And terrestrial types of this kind, particularly the contemporary ones, can never discover anything quite new. And indeed it appeared that this matter proceeded there in the following way. A certain Italian abbot, Pedrini by name, was in his town what is called a confessor for a convent. To this abbot confessor there often came for confession a nun named Ephrosinia. From the stories told about her, it seems that she frequently fell into a certain particular state, and while in this state she displayed manifestations unusual for her environment. During confession she complained to the abbot Pedrini that at times she was unmistakably under the influence of diabolical suggestions. Everything she herself said and the stories circulated about her interested the abbot Pedrini, and he became very desirous of convincing himself personally about them. Once, during confession, he tried by all possible means to evoke frankness in this nun, and he got to know, among other things, that this nun novice had had a lover who had once given her his portrait framed in a very beautiful frame, and that she permitted herself during periods of resting from her prayers to admire this picture of her sweetheart, and that, as it seemed to her, the diabolical suggestion proceeded in her just as these said periods of her resting. All this, told frankly by the nun, still further excited the interest of the Abbot Pedrini, and he decided at all costs to find out the cause of it. And with this aim in view, he first of all asked the nun, Euphrosynia, to be sure to bring with her to the next confession the portrait of her sweetheart, together with the frame. At the next confession the nun took with her this said portrait. There was nothing very special about it, but the frame indeed was unusual, it being all encrusted with mother of pearl and various coloured stones. While the abbot and the nun were together examining the portrait in the frame, the abbot suddenly noticed that something particular began to proceed with the nun. First she became pale, and for a certain time she became, as it were, petrified, and then there began with her on the spot, precisely in all details, the same manifestations which proceed there among the newly married at what is called the first night. After all this, the Abbot Pedrini desired still more to make clear to himself all the causes of such an unusual manifestation. But as regards the nun, she recovered 2 hours after the beginning of this particular state of hers, and it was discovered that she knew and remembered nothing of what had happened to her. As the Abbot Pedrini himself alone could not unravel this certain phenomena, he turned for help to his acquaintance, a certain Dr. Bambini. Well, when the Abbot Pedrini told everything in detail to the Dr. Bambini, the latter also became very much interested, and from then on they both began to occupy themselves with the elucidation of it all. They first made various elucidating experiments upon the nun Euphrosynia herself, and after several what are there called séances, they noticed that this nun invariably fell into such a peculiar state of hers only when her gaze rested for rather a long time on one of the brilliant coloured stones, on what is called a Persian turquoise, which was among the adornments of the frame of this portrait. But later, when with this same Persian turquoise they continued to make their elucidating experiments upon others, they then soon became categorically convinced, firstly, that in almost any one of the free-brained beings, without distinction of sex, who gazes for a long time at shining and brilliant objects of a certain kind, there begins to proceed a state similar to the one which proceeded with the first subject of their experiments, and secondly, they notice further that the form of manifestation of the subject during the state varies, and is found to be dependent on the former being experiences which chance to be predominant, and on the shining objects with which a connection was accidentally established during such experiences of theirs. And if you want to know what happens next, you need to go and read the chapter Hypnotism in All and Everything. I thought it quite interesting that he was talking about these demonic, diabolical suggestions, which many serial killers themselves say, the devil made me do it, or that they heard voices that told them to do it. And there's all kinds of theories of, we have this, what is it, brain to skull technology or whatever it is, voice to skull technology, that people are being made to do things. But maybe it's some kind of demonic. As I've said before, the demonics come through our heads, whereas Christ comes through our heart. But also looking at shiny things, I love a shiny thing. I'm a bit of a magpie myself. I love my crystals and I love looking into mirrors. I remember years ago doing mirror, they were mirror exercises when I was becoming involved with a certain order. Very interesting to do these kinds of things, of looking at yourself and looking to get to know yourself and who you are, and really looking into your eyes. I think they're quite good experiments to do, but you must protect yourself before you do them, because I do believe mirrors are portals. So do be careful looking into a mirror. And I've heard of other people seeing other beings come behind, they can see somebody else behind them in the mirror, and then they look behind them and there isn't somebody there. I know people that have tried to invoke people, gods or other beings through them, so do be careful of that kind of thing. But this does lead to the idea of attachments, or some people call them hitchhikers, when you do this kind of thing, that they jump upon you and stay with you and do try to influence you and whisper in your ears. And I think this is something Gurdjieff would be quite against doing. Now, the word mirror doesn't seem to be in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. Maybe I've just not been able to find it yet. But he talks about reflection. We should be reflecting on ourselves, when a mirror obviously is a reflection when we're looking upon ourselves. But we should also be reflecting on our inner selves and our outer selves, our outer actions. And he talks about how, in order that the presences of learned, free-centered beings might be reflected for their own essences, and that the presence of the mentioned objects might also be reflected, so that thereby the perception of the reality of the said objects might be actualized by their imperfect organs of being sight in a vacuum. Now, what does that mean? It's quite interesting, really, isn't it? What are we trying to reflect upon, and what are we doing? A lot of the time, being imperfect, we're trying to become perfect beings. And he talks about how the Kundabuffer was what was making us see things with a reflection. I'm trying to find where that is. The root of the second half of the word Kundabuffer chanced to coincide with a word in the language of that time which meant reflection, concerning the origin of the word Kundalina. But still not Kundalini. Many people get Kundalini and Kundabuffer mixed up. And he does say this in Beelzebub's Tales on page 230, or it might be 250, that people often get the Kundalini confused with the Kundabuffer. You know, and the Kundabuffer was put there so that... Where is it? Let me try and find it. So it was put there, the sacred members of this most high commission then reasoned that if the said mechanical instinct in these biped free-brain beings should develop towards the attainment of objective reason, as usually occurs, then it might quite possibly happen that they would prematurely comprehend the real cause of their arising in existence and make a great deal of trouble. In view of this, the Most High Commission then decided, among other things, provisionally to implant into the common presences of the free-brain beings there a special organ with a property such that, first, they should perceive reality topsy-turvy, and secondly, that every repeated impression from outside should crystallize in them data which would engender factors for invoking in them sensations of pleasure and enjoyment. And obviously that's now been removed, but people still act as if they have the Kundabuffer on them. But I think people also can turn to the opposite of pleasure and enjoyment and fall down into darkness of some kind. And what we should be doing instead should be striving towards reaching back up so that we do begin to comprehend the real cause of our arising and existence. And of course, Ashiata Shirmash was sent out in the book, Beelzebub's Tales, to help humanity find their way back to developing their spiritualized being parts again, to help them go from ordinary waking consciousness to becoming aware of the divine and reaching a more divine, what would it be, divine objective conscience, to connect with that, which is what we should be doing. I'm just trying to find it. Oh, gee, I found it. Almost all of your favourites wished and began to strive with all their spiritualised being parts to have in their ordinary waking conscious the divine, genuine, objective conscience, and began to work upon themselves under the guidance of initiates and priests of the brotherhood Heech Tovari, sent out by Ashiata Shirmash, in order to have the possibility of completely removing from themselves, perhaps for ever, the maleficent consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, both those personally acquired and those passed to them by heredity. So this is a mission we should be working at, to have those whether it's passed by hereditary, the Kunda buffer influences, and instead, like that film They Live by John Carpenter, we need to put on them special sunglasses so that we can see life for what it really is. But I found it interesting, Edward Burroughs' painting of Beelzebub, standing here looking like a bit of a cool evil dude, looking out at all the turmoil and chaos that he has helped create by whispering in men's ears. Obviously, in All and Everything, Gurdjieff is given Beelzebub a different persona, but maybe this painting is depicting how Beelzebub once was, or how most people see Beelzebub. I'm not saying that we treat Beelzebub as a god or anything, but the whole point of Beelzebub's tales to his grandson is the discussion of how one does reach back up to God by spiritualizing your organs, both inner and outer. We're striving to develop our being. We're trying to work with the wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling. We're transubstantiating in ourselves for our being. This is something we should be working at all the time. It was a prayer that Gurdjieff wrote for us to give to our common Father, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiating me for my being. Because if we can learn to become awake and developed and attuned to our divine source and listening to our conscience rather than being a mechanical automaton, then we will start making a difference on this planet and for those people around us, which will then hopefully ripple out. The effect will ripple out to other people. But as we're seeing in this world, many people don't like people that are waking up. They find it, or making an effort to bring peace to this world. And that's because the little demonics are whispering in their ears, trying to keep them in a darker side, on the darkest, not to awaken to their conscience. They're being told what to think and feel, where when we awaken to our conscience, we actually feel and think and speak rightly. And that's the important thing here, thinking and feeling and being, I was going to say in a righteous way, but I suppose it is in a righteous way, which many people, it would sound like I'm being, a bit above myself. He says again, this is Ashiata Shirmash, although the factors for engendering in their presences the sacred being impulses of faith, hope and love are already quite degenerated in the beings of this planet, nevertheless, the factor which ought to engender that being impulse on which the whole psyche of beings of a free brain system is in general based, and which impulse exists under the name of objective conscience, is not yet atrophied in them, but remains in their presences almost in its primordial state. So we should be working towards creating an impulse of objective conscience within ourselves. And that takes inner considering and all the other exercises that Gurdjieff brings to us through his writings and works. And I think this is a very difficult time to do it, but it's a good time to do it, because as certain people are trying to bring peace to this world in certain countries that might ripple out for others. Okay, there's still war going on in other places, but we need to bring peace to ourselves so that we can then send back up to our Divine Father. The sorrows of our Father, I'm pretty sure, is because people are still hating each other. And it just reminds me of Christ's words in the John Gospel, where Christ almost pleads, children, love one another. And that's what we should be trying to do instead of destroying each other all the time. Stop the destruction and start loving. Awaken to Conscience. So I thank you all for listening. My books are still available on Amazon at the moment. My one about forgiveness, which is called... oh, I've forgotten the name of it. Having a bit of a mind fart. Brain fart. Exorcising Witches, which is all about a priest that can see the demons that people have on them, and how he deals with them is what we should be doing. So thanks again, everybody. Love and peace to one and all. Thank you to those that have bought my books recently, and love to the whole world.